First up is Arthur Dawson. Arthur is an historical ecologist at Baseline Consulting. He has worked on numerous research projects involving land cover and use in hydrology, hydrological change for local, state, federal agencies and conservation organizations. Arthur was previously employed at Sonoma Ecology Center. He graduated from Humboldt State in 1983 with a bachelor's degree in natural resources management with minors in biology and history. Fun fact, Arthur also attended Chico State from 1978 to 1982, taking botany classes and field trips with Barbara Castro and Rob Schlesing. The title of his presentation is Vegetation Trends and Cycles in Fire-Prone Landscapes of Lake, Napa, and Sonoma Counties. Let's welcome Arthur.
Thanks, Joe. And yeah, it's sad to hear that Barbara wasn't going to be here this year, but have a lot of good memories from taking plant tax with her in Rob Schlesing's class. And if you're out there, hi, I hope you're joined us for the, virtually. Also, we just wanted to say what a great conference this has been so far, and it's been kind of a tour of Northern California to some of the most interesting and beautiful places like Marble Mountains. I love the marbles, backpack there, vernal pools, and now I'm really curious to get more into bryophytes. So thank you all to all the presenters for all the good presentations. And I'll see if I can figure out the technology here. So this is a CALFIRE funded project. I did it in partnership with Pepperwood Preserve and also with Tukman Geospatial. So you've heard Mark Tukman mentioned a few times over the last couple of days, and also Jim Thorne, who's at UC Davis. And so we did this project together. And so the idea was to look at really long-range changes and trends, both for fire and for vegetation. And part of it was the choice of study areas was partly from places that CALFIRE had identified as locations where communities or natural resources were at risk for wildfire. And then also places where I was able to find out that there were long-term vegetation records available going back about 150 years. And so we chose 4 study areas. And let's see if I can find which one's the laser? Anybody know? Let's see. Well, I don't want to turn this thing off, but there we go. There we go. Okay. So so we have Napa East, which is northeast of the city of Napa, Sonoma Napa, which straddles the ridge between Sonoma and Napa Valleys, just east of Glen Ellen and north of the town of Sonoma. Then over here, Sonoma West is Guerneville is right down here in the lower southwest corner, and the Russian River is along the southern part of this. And then the lake study area includes Cobb Mountain and almost Middletown, and so up in that area. So these are the key questions that we were asking. There were vegetation patterns, changes over time, fire patterns, and also the relationship between vegetation, fire, and people. I think those are really the 3 key things to think about when we're thinking about both fire and vegetation. And the hope was that the results of this would help come up with some management ideas for improving ecological health of the landscape, also lowering the chance of catastrophic fire, and I'll explain my definition for that toward the end of the talk, and then maximizing carbon sequestration and emissions. And that was a tougher one to get to, but so I'm going to skip that one. And this talk is going to focus on the Sonoma Napa study area and the Sonoma West study area. As it turned out, Napa East was quite different than the other 3 study areas. And just for one example, there's virtually no Douglas fir there, whereas other places, Douglas fir has been expanding quite a bit. So I'm just going to focus on those 2 areas. And Lake County is similar to Sonoma West and Sonoma Napa, but it would add more complications, so I've only got 15 minutes, so I'm going to keep moving. So this is just a brief summary of the sources. Everything from recent vegetation maps that have been made. Sonoma and Napa County have them as recently as 2016, and then going back, the WHR maps from Fish and Wildlife, and then before that, soil veg maps, and then vegetation type maps from the early 20th century, sometimes called the Wieslander maps. And then to go beyond that, you have to go back to the early General Land Office surveys, and you'll see how that plays out. And then a little bit of early narratives. Mostly I was looking for mappable data, but early narratives sometimes were not mappable, but they were informative, if you want to think of it that way. And then for the fire record, narratives also went back to the early 19th century. And then it was possible to map. Basically what this project did was extend the CALFIRE record back from the 1940s back into the 1870s, where there were newspaper records of wildfires. They usually would talk about, so-and-so's ranch burned or this bridge on this road burned and mention the size of the fire. So it was actually possible to plot approximate fire perimeters for some of these early fires and see how those lined up with more recent fires. And then, of course, the CALFIRE maps for the last 70 or 80 years are the best source for those things. But I want to start with indigenous wisdom. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, let's see. Let me go back just for a second. So in between these two is indigenous wisdom, sometimes called traditional ecological knowledge. And this really combines, this is generational knowledge that's been passed down really since time immemorial, as it's often stated. And so it really combines the knowledge of both fire and vegetation. It integrates these two. And then to some degree, I've done some oral histories, and those are represented by local knowledge, which doesn't go as far back, but it still goes back, in some cases, over 100 years. So people who know things they've either seen or their parents or their grandparents saw. But I want to start with indigenous wisdom, because I think this is really the framework to think about fire and vegetation change. This is Clint McKay. He's on the Tribal Advisory Council at Pepperwood. He was really the richest source of information from tribal people, from indigenous folks, and he was brought up by people who really knew the traditional ways. And when I asked him what was his earliest memory of cultural burning, he said, well, I really can't say. I was probably in a baby basket the first time I saw a fire. And this is something our people have been doing, for as long as anybody knows. So Clint really holds the thread that goes all the way back. It's quite impressive. And in fact, at the Dry Creek Rancheria, they've been practicing cultural burning pretty much without a stop. It's different than it was because it's smaller areas, but he has an experience in cultural burning, over his entire lifetime. And so kind of an amazing person to have contact with. So one of the points that he wanted to make very clear was that there's a real difference between cultural burning and prescriptive burning. And it all comes back to who is it intended to benefit? Is it just for people, or are you thinking about all the organisms on the landscape and how it might benefit other species besides people? And then this is a quote from Sarah Moncada, who's the director of Heron Shadow, which is being managed with kind of a combination of indigenous ideas and more Western style management, but it's intended to benefit indigenous people in the Bay Area mostly. And so this is one thing that she said is that indigenous people consider fire a member of the community, which kind of blew my mind to hear that. And I think Smokey the Bear was off in the corner kind of grimacing when I heard her say that, because this is so much at odds with what I grew up with, and yet it makes so much sense. And then up in the corner there you can see, so here's Clint. This is his family. I forgot to mention that. He's doing a cultural burn at Pepperwood with his family, and you could say that the fire he's about to light is really part of that family circle he's got. And then if you go out another little bit, there's the trees that are also relatives. So, it comes down to what's our role in the landscape? Are we trying to control things, or is it about relationship? I like to think of it that indigenous relationship with the landscape is more like a marriage. And if I said, well, I manage my wife, I don't think she'd be with me very long. So it's really about relationship. And I think that's how I'm thinking about it. So it's about tending and stewardship, and not, you know, wildfire, just the idea of a wildfire is something beyond human control. Well, you know, there are ways to bring fire kind of back into a relationship with us without assuming we have control over it. And then this was another quote from Redbird, who also was at Heron Shadow. And you know, I showed him the maps that you're about to see, and he said, well, yep, that's what the place looks like when it's not being tended properly, which was a great perspective. You know, and I think he's right. I think this is how things look when they're not being tended properly. And this quote down at the bottom, or this, so covered with chemizal, that's from these early surveys, 1870. And chemizal is just the word that was used for chemise. It's probably got a Spanish origin. So we're going back about, well, my great-grandparents who I met, or several of them, they were born in the 1870s. So these surveys go back to the time of my great-grandparents. So I'll start with the vegetation data. I'm not going to go into detail here, but all the vegetation data that I used could be slotted into the same categories that the MCV uses for life forms. So there's grasslands, there's shrubs, and there's forest. And then on top of that, you can also divide up the forest into conifers and hardwoods. And then anything that doesn't fit into those categories, you can put into the human and the other. And I've been working on this for many years, and I'd be happy to talk more about the methods, but in the interest of time, I'll keep going. So this is the same, this color key will hold true throughout all these slides. And what you're seeing right here, all these lines, these are township and range lines that I'm sure just about all of you have seen on topo maps. And the surveyors were required to record the vegetation in order of abundance as they walk these lines for every mile. So they'd walk a mile, these are 1 mile lengths here. So they walk a mile and then they record the vegetation in order of abundance, which really, when it boils down to it, that's how, you know, all vegetation mapping happens pretty much, is by order of abundance. What's the most dominant thing on the landscape? So, so you can see there's quite a bit of chaparral. There's a little bit of conifers high on the ridge, and that's probably mostly Douglas fir. And then the blue is hardwood forest. So we go ahead 60 years. This is from the Wieslander maps, and so still lots of chaparral. Not much conifer still. Conifers are still pretty high up. Then we're going to go ahead about another 60 years. And here's, this is WHR maps, so you can see the chaparral is starting to be covered with forest, and a lot more Douglas fir coming in. And then this is the this combination of the Sonoma Veg map and the Napa Veg map, so, you know, let's just say approximately 2015, right in between those two dates. And you can see the chaparral is really getting filled in with trees. And of course, you know, we had our big fire in Sonoma in 2017, so this is conditions immediately before a big wildfire. Or another way to look at it is just putting it into these pie charts, and you can see, I mean, I tend to think of this as kind of like a clock, you know, and these things are ticking through, and then eventually you'll get another fire, but I'll go into more detail on that. And then just quickly to look at Sonoma West, same thing. So we've got this time sequence. Now, so this is the redwood region. This was down here. This was redwoods. This is the area that was logged heavily between about 1875 and 1915, and we don't have any early 20th century maps, so I got to jump ahead to 1965. So this basically is a landscape that's in recovery from logging, and you can see the hardwoods have mostly come in where the conifers were, where the redwoods were. But then jump ahead to 1993, we've got lots of conifers coming in, and the red is actually, that's all development, right? That's people with vacation homes in Guerneville. And then here, even more conifers. There's actually less red in this map, and I think that's because the conifers are covering over the roofs of the houses. So when it got mapped, it was mapped as conifer forest. But I doubt that, you know, these houses in here disappeared. They're just not visible from the air. Okay, fire data. So, so this is going back to the Sonoma Napa area. You know, pretty astounding. How many fires have happened up here, up to 7 fires in some places. So I outlined, this is a frequent burn zone within the red, and that's a contiguous area that had 4 to 7 fires. And amazingly, there's areas very close by that had no fires, or at least no documented fires. So quite a range of fire histories across the landscape. And then a similar situation in Sonoma West. So here's where the logging happened. There have been no recorded fires there for the whole since 1870 down this area. But up here in the early map, if you notice, there was chaparral up here, and this is where another frequent burn zone. It's a little wetter, so not quite as many fires, but still up to 5 fires have happened up here in the historical record. And then take those two, take the vegetation and fire data and put it together. So we're sticking with Sonoma West at the moment. And so there's the fire history, and here's the vegetation history. And once we get into the vegetation history in relation to the fire, I really think about it as years post-fire as opposed to a calendar date. So 6 years after a fire, this is what the landscape looked like in the frequent burn zone. And I'm focusing on this zone because this is where the changes happen the most rapidly for the vegetation. So it's easiest to see what's going on. So, almost half of that was chaparral, 6 years after the 1959 fire. But then we go ahead about 30 years, and the chaparral is disappearing. We've lost about 2/3 of the chaparral just in those 30 years. It's getting filled in with forest. And then we go ahead another 10 years, and there's only 7% shrub when, how much would that be? Less than 50 years before it had been half shrub. So there's a tremendous amount of change, tremendously dynamic vegetation on the landscape, something I wouldn't have guessed when I started this, how quickly this happens. I mean, I've been in Sonoma County 35 years, and that's actually a good portion of this 54 years. And then if we come back to Sonoma Napa, it's a very similar situation. So 9 years after the 1923 fire, mostly chaparral, which is probably mostly chamise, a little bit of hardwood and virtually no conifers at that point. But come ahead 29 years, it's filling in with trees. And then come ahead to 2013, and only 13% shrub that had been, almost 75% shrub 9 years after a fire. At 49 years past, in 4 decades, it went from 75% shrub to 13% shrub. And so what did it look like up there? Well, I was lucky enough, the Land Trust hired me to do a property history for Secret Pasture Preserve. So I got to go up there in 2014, and this is what it looked like. Knobcone pines just, falling over because they're getting old in their world. Oaks being completely crowded out by Douglas fir. It was being up there. You just look at the landscape and the vegetation. You go, this place wants to burn. And that was something that Clint told me. He said, we didn't work by a calendar. We just paid attention, and we went by, when the land seemed like it needed to be burned, we burned it. So yeah, here we have knobcone pine that's ready to burn. Seeds won't be released till there's a big fire. Here's just really overgrown chamise. There's manzanita in here. There's also Douglas fir coming up through the chaparral, and even bay trees. Bay trees were pretty common in this situation, and I never thought of bays as being a chaparral species, but in some sense they are. So here are the big fires up there. Fairly regular sequence or fairly regular rhythm, pretty much every 40 or 50 years. 1936 was a smaller fire. It was only about 3,000 acres. The rest of these were anywhere from 10,000 to, I think, 40,000 acres. And then, of course, the 2017 one was the one we just experienced. But, the landscape comes back very quickly. The human community has a harder time recovering, but the natural landscape recovers pretty quick. And, just a few months after the fire and some good rain, we had all kinds of things showing up. This had been a knobcone pine forest. now it's got, forget what kind of flowers these are. I'm not a certified botanist, but this is chamise sprouting from the roots. And this is Bill Basilou. This is some of my local knowledge. He remembered the 1964 fire. So, and he had that same impression. Yeah, it burns and then it comes back. So, so when you start thinking about, what's a tended landscape as opposed to an untended landscape, which I think is what we can call, Sonoma County for the last 150 years at a certain level. So, Clint said they would burn when it felt like it was time. Yeah, he didn't give me a number of years, but I know studies by like Steve Barnhart at, oops, am I done already? Oh, shoot. Oh, shoot. Okay, well, I'll stop right here. So anyway, this is the difference between tended landscape where you have a fire every few years and it comes back and it just does this, or you take longer and you end up with a catastrophic fire. And Paul, I didn't mean to realize I went on so long, but so no questions? Okay. Well, unfortunately, I have to head out, but I think my email is in the program, so please email me if you have any questions.